Charlene Carter's life was forever changed the day her husband and daughter vanished during a sailing trip. The sea, once a place of solace, became the cruel backdrop to her deepest nightmare. For years, Charlene held onto an unwavering hope, refusing to let go despite the world urging her to accept the impossible. Grief became her constant companion, but so did the search for answers, the quest for closure. And then, one day, everything changed. A blurry video arrived, a fleeting glimpse that hinted at a truth Charlene could never have imagined. What she thought was a journey of mourning and loss soon transformed into one of deep betrayal. This was no longer just about finding the missing pieces of her family. It was about uncovering the darker truths buried within her own life. As Charlene's hopes slowly gave way to painful revelations, the lines between love, trust, and deception began to blur. What began as a mother's search for justice would soon reveal a far more sinister reality, a twisted betrayal that would shatter everything she thought she knew. The truth, once hidden beneath layers of grief, was now impossible to ignore. The video wasn't just an answer. It was the key to a nightmare she had yet to fully understand. Malcolm Bennett lived a life of calculated discipline. His background in the military had shaped him into a man of few words, yet every movement carried a sense of control and purpose. To the outside world, Malcolm exuded strength and reliability. He was the type of man people trusted to keep order in a chaotic world. In his uniform, he commanded respect, and outside of it, he wore a different, almost too perfect mask of the loving father and devoted husband. Yet beneath that composed exterior, a darker side began to emerge, one that Charlene would never see coming. Before Malcolm, Charlene had faced her own devastating grief. She was a mother, a woman who had lost her previous husband under mysterious circumstances, leaving her with nothing but unanswered questions and the heavy burden of raising her young daughter, Ayanna, alone. Every day was a battle to rebuild, to hold her family together, and to ensure Ayanna never felt the absence of the father she never knew. The pain of loss ran deep, but Charlene, with her unwavering strength, had carried on. She made a home out of sadness, built a life with the remnants of the past, always searching for stability, always hoping that one day her heart could heal. Then Malcolm entered their lives, seemingly out of nowhere, yet so perfectly fitting into the fractured pieces of their existence. They met at church, a place of solace and community, and it didn't take long for Charlene to be drawn to him. Malcolm was everything she had longed for: dependable, composed, the steady presence that promised to restore the balance she had lost. As time went on, he became part of their daily life, blending seamlessly into their world. Charlene saw him as her second chance at happiness, a chance to heal and to build a future. With Ayanna growing fond of him too, everything seemed perfect, a dream coming true, until the cracks began to show. As the days passed, subtle shifts began to ripple through Charlene's seemingly perfect family. It started with small changes in Ayanna's behavior, ones that might have been easy to overlook if you weren't looking closely. She became withdrawn, no longer participating in the school activities she once loved. Ayanna began spending long hours locked in her room, doors firmly shut, a silence that wasn't there before. At first, Charlene thought it was just the typical teenage rebellion, something to be expected as Ayanna grew older and more independent. But as the days turned into weeks, Charlene couldn't help but notice the quiet tension building between them, the space growing wider between mother and daughter. Malcolm, always steady and composed, seemed to be the one Ayanna turned to more and more. He would quietly encourage her to spend time with him, offering his guidance and wisdom, which Charlene, in her trusting nature, accepted. It seemed harmless at first, a father figure simply bonding with his stepdaughter. But as time passed, Charlene began to notice the way Ayanna's eyes would light up whenever Malcolm entered the room, how her demeanor softened when they were alone together. The unease inside Charlene began to grow, a gnawing feeling she couldn't quite place. Yet, she told herself it was just a phase, nothing more than the complicated dance of family dynamics. That was until one evening, while tidying up Ayanna's room, Charlene stumbled across her daughter's journal. With trembling hands, She read the words scribbled inside. The sea feels safer than land. At first, Charlene dismissed it as a fleeting thought, a poetic metaphor. But the more she read, the more those words clung to her, their meaning growing heavier in her mind. They were words tinged with something darker, something that didn't sit right. Charlene's heart sank, the weight of her daughter's words settling in her chest. The first seeds of doubt began to sprout. Could it be possible that there was something more going on between Malcolm and Ayanna than she had ever imagined? Could the man she trusted so completely be hiding something far more sinister? A cold shiver ran down her spine as she stared at the journal, her mind racing to connect the dots. What was really happening within the walls of her home? And how had she missed it? Charlene's doubts began to fester, quietly creeping in, fueled by small but unsettling details. The second backpack was the first clue, a seemingly insignificant object, yet it lingered in her mind, refusing to be dismissed. She had seen it before, tucked away out of view, but now it was left carelessly in the hallway. Ayanna had never mentioned it, and Charlene's thoughts spiraled, questioning why something so trivial was causing such a gnawing feeling in her chest. The unease only deepened as Charlene overheard Ayanna's friend mentioning odd things about her mother and Malcolm, casual, offhand remarks that felt like coded hints. Why did Ayanna's friend speak in hushed tones when Charlene entered the room? What was the unspoken tension in their conversations? Charlene tried to push the growing sense of unease aside, but each new oddity, the distant glances, the whispered conversations, and the strange disconnect between her daughter and Malcolm, only made it harder to ignore the questions mounting in her mind. The tipping point came when Charlene received the 26-second video. At first, it was nothing but a blurry, shaky recording. But as the frames snapped into focus, her breath caught in her throat. It was them, Malcolm and Ayanna, alive together somewhere else. A place that wasn't the home Charlene had once believed to be her sanctuary. Her heart raced as the truth began to form in front of her eyes. Her family, the very people she trusted most, had been hiding something far darker than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a cruel trick of the mind. It was real. The revelation broke Charlene. The woman who had once been a grieving widow, haunted by the loss of her husband and daughter, was now a woman driven by an unrelenting need for the truth. She could no longer ignore what her heart had known for years, buried beneath the surface of denial. With shaky hands and a heart heavy with betrayal, Charlene made the decision to go to Ecuador, to confront the lives her family had built without her. The emotional transformation was palpable, a shift from victim to agent of her own fate. She would no longer be the widow waiting for answers. Now, she was the woman who would seek the truth no matter where it led. The past 12 years of grief had led her here, and the path forward was one she would walk alone. Charlene's heart pounded as she carefully tracked their movements in Ecuador. Her eyes never left them. Malcolm and Ayanna, moving through the crowded streets of a city that should have been a place of safety. They weren't father and daughter, as Charlene had believed for so long. No, this was something far darker. She watched as they strolled hand in hand through the market, laughing softly to each other. Their proximity too intimate, too comfortable for the supposed familial bond they had once shared. A kiss on the cheek, a whispered word, the way Malcolm looked at Ayanna. Every gesture screamed of betrayal. Charlene's breath hitched in her chest, each passing moment deepening the pit of anguish that had already been hollowing her out. It was all true. The lies, the manipulation, the years of pretending everything was fine when all along, they were living a different life, one without her in it. The confrontation was inevitable. She had to confront them now. She couldn't just stand by and pretend this didn't break her heart into pieces. The moment arrived in a quiet cafe, tucked away in a corner of the city. Charlene waited until they were seated before making her presence known. When she spoke, her voice was calm but sharp, each word calculated, leaving no room for doubt. She knew. She had seen them. There was no escaping the truth now. Malcolm, Anna, I know everything. Her voice cut through the quiet cafe, laced with a venom she could barely suppress. You both thought you could deceive me forever. But this is too much. Malcolm froze. His face paled, and Ayana's eyes darted nervously, searching for a way to escape, a way to deny. Malcolm cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to explain. Charlene, please, let me explain. His voice faltered. But Charlene wasn't interested in explanations. Her eyes, cold and unwavering, locked onto his with a finality he could not deny. No, no more explanations. You've already destroyed everything I held dear. Her voice was steady, but beneath it lay years of anguish and pain, the culmination of 12 years of deception and betrayal. And in that moment, the anger, grief, and confusion she had carried with her all these years finally found their outlet. She stood up, her movement deliberate, slow, like a predator sizing up its prey. She reached into her bag, pulling out the gun she had carried, the weight of it almost comforting in her hand. Time seemed to stretch as she aimed it at Malcolm and Ayana, her eyes locked on the two of them, the faces that had once been her world, now irrevocably broken. In the blink of an eye, the gun discharged. The sound echoed in the silent cafe like a clap of thunder, and the world around Charlene seemed to slow. The betrayal had been answered. The justice she so desperately sought had been delivered in an instant. Charlene stood there for a moment, her emotions a tangled mess of disbelief and relief. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she was calm. It was done. The life she had once known had been shattered, but at least now, she knew the truth. In that silence, Charlene understood one thing. The emotional freedom she had been seeking for so long had come at a devastating cost. The aftermath unfolded slowly, almost surreal in its stillness. Charlene stood motionless in the cafe, the gun still clutched in her trembling hand. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, but her face remained unreadable, almost serene. The world outside was a blur to her now. The chaos of what she had just done, the noise, the shock, didn't seem real. The violence had not shaken her. It had been a long time coming. She knew what she had to do, and she did it with a quiet sense of finality. No running, no escaping, just the calm realization that her journey had reached its tragic end. She placed the gun gently on the table, her hands steady now. She didn't need to look at it. There was no need for shame or guilt in that moment. All the anger, the confusion, the years of longing for answers had funneled into this. The weight had been lifted, and then came the silence, the deadly quiet that fell over the cafe after the gunshot. The other patrons, frozen in shock, whispered in disbelief, eyes wide in horror. It didn't take long for the authorities to arrive, the sound of sirens piercing the calm. Charlene didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply stood there, as though waiting for the inevitable. Her fate had been sealed the moment the bullet left the chamber. The neighbors' reactions were immediate. Shock, fear, disbelief. The couple who had once been regarded as pillars of the community, Malcolm and Ayana, had now become criminals in the eyes of everyone who had ever known them. Charlene had lived in a world of lies for 12 years. And now, with one act, she had exposed the darkness that had been hidden behind closed doors. When the officers arrived, Charlene didn't resist. She didn't struggle or try to escape the inevitable. Her steps were slow and deliberate as they approached her, the reality of the situation settling in. The weight of her actions didn't crush her. Instead, it brought a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She surrendered herself quietly, her heart heavy, but her mind clearer than it had been in years. The interrogation room was cold, sterile. The walls closed in, but Charlene didn't flinch. She had already faced the darkness inside her, and now she could speak of it without hesitation. When asked why she had done it, Charlene's voice was calm, methodical, devoid of emotion. "They betrayed me," she said simply, as though it was the only answer that mattered. "They lied to me. They tore apart everything I believed in, and I couldn't let them get away with it. They deserved to face the consequences." Her confession wasn't a plea for sympathy or understanding. It was the voice of a woman who had been broken, piece by betrayal and deception, until she had no choice but to act. As she spoke, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The weight of the 12 years of grief, the slow unraveling of her identity, had finally come to a head. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into the cafe all those years ago, searching for answers. She had been consumed by the loss, by the slow erosion of everything she once believed. In the end, Charlene had found closure, but it was a hollow, painful sort of peace. The woman who had once loved Malcolm, the mother who had raised Ayanna, had disappeared in the wake of betrayal. And in their place was someone who had been forged in grief and vengeance. "I had to do it," she repeated quietly. "I had to make them pay for what they did to me." The courtroom was tense, filled with an air of both disbelief and resolution. Charlene sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The days of emotional torment, the years of unanswered questions, and the slow, agonizing realization of betrayal had brought her to this moment. Now, here she was, fighting not just for her freedom, but for her very soul. The prosecution wasted no time framing Charlene as a woman who had crossed a line, a calculated individual who had taken matters into her own hands without mercy. The attorney's voice echoed through the courtroom as he painted Charlene as a cold-blooded killer, someone who had been deceived but chose to take violent action to get revenge. Her cold detachment, the prosecutor argued, her methodical planning, the lack of remorse. It shows a woman who acted out of bitterness, not out of any sense of justice. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They spoke of a woman who had suffered immeasurable loss, of a mother who had endured 12 years of emotional abuse and manipulation at the hands of the two people she trusted most. They spoke of Charlene's grief, the years of questioning, of the psychological erosion caused by constant doubt and betrayal. "She didn't act out of malice," the defense attorney implored. "She acted out of desperation. Desperation to find closure. Desperation to regain control of her life. She was a victim of betrayal. She deserves understanding, not punishment." As the trial went on, Charlene's mind often wandered. She had been so certain of her actions, so sure that she had made the right decision in the heat of the moment. But now, in this sterile environment, surrounded by the harsh judgment of others, doubt crept in. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for her understanding of right and wrong. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest. But she didn't falter. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room went silent. Charlene's heart beat loudly in her chest as the judge read aloud the decision, "Guilty of second-degree murder." The charge was a lesser one than the prosecution had hoped for, but the consequences were still severe. The judge explained that the emotional toll Charlene had endured over the years had been taken into account, but it was still a tragic act of violence. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. In that moment, Charlene didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel relief. What she felt was something deeper, acceptance. She had done what she had to do, and now she had to face the consequences, just as anyone would have to when taking a life. There was no turning back now. As the gavel struck, Charlene felt her body relax, the tension that had built up over the past weeks finally beginning to dissipate. The emotional and mental turmoil that had been eating away at her for years finally came to a close. The silence of the courtroom was a strange comfort to her, a finality that brought an eerie peace. Later that night, in the quiet of her cell, Charlene sat at a small desk. She took out a pen and began to write, the ink flowing freely as she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She wrote not as a woman broken by loss, but as one who had found a strange peace through her actions, as if the words had become the only way to give meaning to the chaos. She finished the entry and closed the notebook, the soft click of the cover signaling the end of the day. She laid down, staring at the ceiling as the last thoughts of her past life drifted away. And finally, Charlene Carter slept. As the story of Charlene Carter unfolds, we are left with a haunting question. Was her act of violence one born out of justice, Or was it the devastating result of years of unresolved grief and betrayal? The lines between right and wrong blur as we witness her emotional journey from a woman seeking closure to someone consumed by the pain of being wronged. Charlene's actions, while shocking and tragic, force us to confront the complexities of human emotion and morality. Her quest for justice is a moral gray area, where the boundaries between vengeance and justice are difficult to distinguish. Was it truly an act of justice for a mother who had been deceived by the two people she trusted most? Or was it a desperate cry for the closure she could never find? The question lingers. Would you have done the same thing in Charlene's shoes? Would you have been able to walk away, knowing that the people you loved were responsible for the greatest betrayal of your life? Or would the pain drive you to take matters into your own hands? This story is about more than just revenge. It's about the psychological toll that betrayal can have on a person and how it can distort their sense of self, turning them into someone unrecognizable. It's about the complexity of grief, the way it can paralyze, consume, and ultimately push a person to act in ways they never thought possible. Charlene's journey reminds us of the profound need for closure that we all seek in our lives when faced with betrayal, loss, and emotional devastation. Yet, her story also forces us to ask the difficult question: how far is too far when we're trying to make peace with the past? As we reflect on her tragic tale, we are left with a bittersweet understanding. Sometimes, justice isn't as simple as we think. And sometimes, the price of closure is much higher than we could ever imagine. As we reflect on Charlene's heartbreaking journey, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Charlene was justified in her actions? Was she seeking justice? Or was it the overwhelming weight of her grief that pushed her to such a drastic measure? What would you have done differently if you were in her shoes? The complexity of this story invites deep questions about morality, betrayal, and justice. So, share your opinions and engage with others in the comments below. If you want to dive deeper into more true crime stories and explore similar cases, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Stay updated on the latest content that digs into the darkest corners of human nature, betrayal, and justice. Your thoughts and engagement are important. Let's keep the conversation going.